Hey everyone, before we jump into this, I just wanted to include a trigger warning because this episode discusses gender-based violence in the Indian and Pakistani contexts mostly. Great, thanks. Alright, hey everyone, back again. Today I'm discussing quite a few different topics. I guess focusing on, and excuse my pronunciation, discussing the work of Saadat Hasan Manto.
Yes.
An Indian Pakistani. How would you?
Well, Manto was definitely born in India when it was not partitioned, when India did not divide into India and Pakistan. So definitely, he was an Indian writer who captured the horrors of the violence and the madness of the partition, and then he later migrated to Pakistan.
Right. So I'm joined by Deeplina, and we're going to be discussing his work, including a myriad other topics around the issue of Indian partition, which we'll get into in a lot more detail. Before jumping into that, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy. If you want to mostly see pictures of my cats, you can find this in podcast form if you're listening to it on YouTube, pretty much anywhere you get podcasts, or if you're listening to this in podcast form, you can go to YouTube, on which sometimes I include videos that you might like to see for whatever reason. You can also support me by subscribing, liking, sharing, telling your friends. Who knows? They might love it. You can contribute monetarily, but I would like to say first for you to take care of yourself. And, if you're considering donating to me now, consider deferring that and maybe giving to an organization in need, be it Black Lives Matter or any other organization representing a marginalized group or a group doing work at any part of the world that happens to need help. That would be greatly appreciated. Without further ado, I present you Deeplina. And Deeplina, what do you do? What is your claim to fame?
So I am a PhD student going to my second year in the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at the University of Western Ontario. My research lies at the intersection of genocide, humanitarian assistance, and sexual violence, and I'm particularly interested to investigate the Rohingya genocide. And yes, I think I identify myself as a feminist killjoy because I kind of tend to, I think, now see the problems around gender-based exploitation and economic inequality and the way it disproportionately affect women and gender minority groups and other individuals who are the margins. So I don't think I would I can say that I really enjoy reading or reading some post or watching a movie with a really free mind, like I used to do before starting my PhD. And now, like, if something is problematic, that becomes so visible to me. And I'm like, oh, that's problematic. I shouldn't be, kind of sympathizing with those values. And that is why I kind of find a lot of Bollywood movies that I grew up with in my childhood to be very problematic. And I was like, dang, I did grow up with these movies and these were presented to me, and I kind of, glorified it, celebrated it, only to realize now that those were so problematic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the literary contribution of Saadat Hasan Manto comes, following, did he write before the partition if you know.
Well, yes, he did write before the partition. I think he started writing from, if I'm not mistaken, from mid-1930s, and but I think the stories that he had written a number of stories on different issues, but the stories that stood out to me was his stories around the partition that captured the madness of the partition, the mayhem, the violence, and most importantly, I think, David, when you asked me, like, how do I see Manto, whether he was an Indian writer or a Pakistani writer, now when I think about it after some, seconds of just, kind of brainstorming the question in my mind, I kind of think he was the author from the Indian subcontinent because he believed in the essence of humanity, and he believed that, the partition that was essentially a product of communal, I think, disharmony between communities. And of course, the way the British had presented the communities and have pitted them against each other. So he did not believe in that. He believed in the essence of humanity. And he critiqued the partition because he was at that time capturing and recording the violence that men were committing against each other. That was not called for. A country was divided. A country was, the borders of the country was being rewritten, but the price was paid by common people. A nation was built on the bodies of men, women, and children.
Yeah. And just in case there's someone, listening who doesn't necessarily know, what was the partition and what did it result in?
So the Indian independence movement culminated into the partition in 1947 when India gained its independence, and the two-nation theory had gained momentum long back in the 1920s, and there was already a call for separating the Muslim community from India and for them to have an independent state of their own. Yes, as Pakistan. And, the movement was headed by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who later became the state leader of Pakistan. So it was essentially the borders were redrawn because Pakistan was supposed to be a separate Muslim state that would cater to the Muslim population, and India was supposed to, predominantly have a Hindu population, but there were many Muslims who decided to stay back in India. And when this, this rearranging of the borders were taking place, so many families were uprooted from their homes, were uprooted from their villages where they were born, where they were raised, because we are talking about a time where people were very connected to the soil, to the land where they were born. And, after 200 years of colonial rule and being under the British imperialism, the idea was to have an independent nation that would cater to Indians.
Right.
But before that could happen, India was divided into, Hindus and Muslims. So there was two. I mean, what I really kind of feel, and to this day, what I think is, I have not witnessed the partition. I am a secondary witness of the partition because I have read the way partition has been captured in popular literature, and interviews and videos of partition survivors. And to this day, I think that, the partition was a political choice. I'm not getting into the debate of whether it could be avoided or not. But I think, this choice was not given to the people. The people did not, have the choice to kind of say that, hey, I don't want to be uprooted from my home, from my family, where I lived. I mean, definitely there was a call for, for Muslims to feel safe in a different state, and for India to kind of be a country that would cater to both Hindus and Muslims, because like I said, that many Muslims decided to stay back and they were welcome in the country. But what was the cost of the partition? We often talk about, the politics of the partition, whether it was a political choice, how it could be averted, but I do not find a lot of engagement. I mean, there are scholarly engagement, of course, but engagement among people like us, like who are a product of the partition. Like my grandparents were refugees.
Right.
And I do not, like, even in my family with my, cousins and siblings, I've never sat down with them and talked about the human cost of partition. What was the human value of partition? Like, what did the partition actually result in?
Yeah. And Manto captures that.
Yeah.
And being a literary writer, he was writing fiction, a lot of it, right? But it was historically motivated. Like,
yes.
He was, and there was from this article, and I should give credit to the article titled "Memories of Partition: Revisiting Saadat Hasan Manto" by Saadat Tawari, and they make the case that historians have forgotten the real people's experiences, choosing instead to focus on what they call high politics, like focusing on the dominant voices and forgetting the day-to-day voices, women, children, marginalized, even men, like that were of lower classes, lower castes. So how did Manto capture that in his writings? Like, how did he do it?
Yeah, there are a couple of short stories of Manto that stood out to me, and personally, I think among many Manto enthusiasts, if I may put it that way, Thanda Gosht, cold meat, cold dough, like I think it translates to the scream, and Toba Tek Singh. These are three stories that particularly stood out to me as they captured the madness, the mayhem, the violence that was the Indian partition. And with Toba Tek Singh, it's really interesting because Manto, I mean, these are short stories, but Manto was brilliantly capturing the trauma of the partition.
Right.
Where this man, Bisan Singh, he is, I mean, I do not want to give away spoilers if somebody
Someone might go and read it.
Yeah, if somebody is interested to read it. But, for this man, Bisan Singh, who has been in a state asylum for, I beg your apology for using the term lunatics. That's how, Manto uses the term.
Right.
So, and he he struggles with his identity because he's unsure, along with other of his inmates, that where is India and where is Pakistan? So if they are in Pakistan, where is India? And if they are in India, then where does Pakistan locate? Where one can locate Pakistan's map in the world map. So there's a lot of confusion about, among common people. Like Manto actually addresses and reflects these questions that people had, like, where do we belong? One night we were, on this side of the border where we belong to India. And after the partition, now suddenly we are uprooted. Suddenly we are told that we do not have ties with the land where we were born. We do not have ties with the land that kind of provided us with food, shelter, identity.
Yeah. And those things are very well connected. That is identity and land. So if you were a Muslim person in what is now kind of bordered as India, at the time, I guess you were expected to, just pick up and go to Pakistan in order to live your life. Whether or not people did that was up to them, as you said. Like, many people decided to stay.
Yes, there were, majorly people were expected to kind of pack their belongings.
But with the drawing of the border, that must have been difficult for those people that were kind of, at the time close to the border. Like, how do you navigate this? Like,
I think, that is very interesting, because the Indian partition that actually the Indian partition witnessed the largest refugee movement in history.
Really?
Yes, and there were millions of people who were crossing the borders. And I should note that, when the borders were redrawn, well, West Pakistan, Pakistan was essentially had like two parts. Like, Pakistan became West Pakistan, the Pakistan that you know as Pakistan now.
Right.
And then Bangladesh became East Pakistan. So, you see, the movement was happening on both sides of the border, like on both sides of the country. There was movement that was happening in the northern side of the border, where people were migrating from Punjab, predominantly Punjab, because that was closer to the borders, and from Bengal. And, people were migrating from what we know as West Bengal and, now what we know as Bangladesh. People were not sure if they were welcome,
right,
in the communities where they lived together, where they survived, natural calamities, where they took part in, the struggle for independence, where they were walking shoulder to shoulder, where they were maybe, kind of sitting under the stars and just contemplating about life. So what does partition mean for the common people?
And like you said, what we now know to be, Pakistan and India, and then Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the other products of partition, was built off of a lot of suffering.
Yeah.
A lot of suffering by poor people, by women, by children.
Yeah.
People that didn't have a lot of power. But for you, and you're particularly interested in this, and you feel that Manto really captures this, the experience of women specifically is something very notable.
Yes.
Women as a result of partition and the kinds of violences that were directed between, Muslim people in Pakistan and Hindu people in India, and how women were almost like a battleground in themselves, where they were a site to exert dominance, where if you could control the other people's women, if you could abduct, assault, rape other people's women, then you would be able to conquer the other people. So what does that mean then, as for India, Pakistan today, for their identities as nations, if they are founded upon this violence? It's a very, very loaded question.
It's a loaded question. I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I would, unpack it one by one.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, that it's pretty loaded, and I think the way I perceive the process of national identity formation or nation building is it's very different from maybe some from one of my contemporaries, from somebody else who is of a different opinion. But I kind of, struggle a lot with the idea of nation building. Especially a nation that is built on bodies of violence.
Right.
A nation that is, I think, for both India and Pakistan, I would give due credit to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and the subsequent prime ministers who invested into making. I do not want to speak for Pakistan because I do not essentially share their culture, their history post-partition, so I would not speak for them. But definitely, I think, with the process of nation building in India, there was a lot of focus on the non-alignment policy, where India was an emerging power, where India was a developing power, and like the Indian partition was followed by the Cold War in 1950s, where the world was divided into two camps, the capitalist camp and the socialist camp, and it was on the developing countries to choose a side.
Sure.
Where they would position themselves, whether with the US or whether with the USSR. But with India trying to actively devise and follow the non-alignment policy and the policy of peaceful coexistence, and really doing quite well with it. But what about the women who were still struggling with PTSD from the partition violence, who were struggling to be accepted in their societies and their families? Manto really kind of hints on this in one of his stories. He kind of suggests that many men who abducted women, these women who were abducted, they were sometimes integrated into the families, and sometimes they were married to their abductors. And in his story Khuda Ki Kasam, in the name of God, he kind of he writes this very beautiful short story about an estranged daughter and a mother who is frantically looking for her daughter, and she would spend days and nights on the street in deplorable condition, but would still not give up the quest of finding her daughter. And she would go on the streets and ask the policeman whether he has seen her daughter. So towards the end, Manto kind of tells the readers that there was a woman who was walking with an Indian man, with a Hindu man, and I think she was in a veil, or she was wearing a ghungat or dupatta, and the man tells this woman that, isn't she your mother? And the woman doesn't kind of acknowledge her mother, and the mother kind of screams Bhagbari, Bhagbari, because she is devastated to know that her daughter refuses to acknowledge her, to identify her, because post-partition she might have found a stability, a peace in this new life that she shares with this man, and she does not want to necessarily go back to a situation where she would make herself more vulnerable to violence, to attacks, by acknowledging her mother. So these I think the question then you ask is, how is it moral that you do not connect with your mother, with somebody who gave birth to you? And how far would you go to kind of completely denounce that relationship in order to kind of not compromise or destabilize the relationship or the stability, the newfound stability and peace that you have found after, periods of violence and communal riots and attacks?
Like, it's almost safer to choose this immediate, you have this man here and you have this identity, than to go back to something that you are perhaps unsure about because, you've gone through all this trauma, and in this process of trauma and this violence, you don't come out the same person.
No.
But other people don't necessarily know that, and that's one of the stories I kind of know about from this article I read. But I should have said this at the beginning, I know very little about this topic generally. But yeah, it seems as though she had no choice but to embrace this new identity. And it speaks to what I know about Manto being someone that, is a Muslim man who was born in India, but who identified after the partition being a Pakistani person and not, and kind of existing on the borderlands, as Ansel Dua says it in in the Latin America context, kind of on the borders, not knowing where to fit, and for a lot of people, it's probably just easier to take that immediate option, whatever seems the most safe at the time, which is how I understood that one story that I knew about. But that's really, and how it was described in the article was that Manto had a dual belonging. Like he
I mean, he lived in Bombay for a long part of his life. I think he also worked in Bombay talkies, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong in that, but he did, work in the entertainment industry. He had colleagues and close friends among Hindu colleagues. So he necessarily did not see them as Hindu.
Yeah.
He saw them as a friend, as a colleague, as a co-worker. And I think this feeling of, of being bitter towards the political result of the partition, or the politics of partition, reflects in his stories, where he constantly tries to kind of, bring to the readers that, see, this is the human cost of partition. There are people who are being uprooted from their homes. There are people who are being killed on trains and carriages and on roads. And people are not just identified as people. People are being marked with religious symbol. People are becoming the symbol of their religion. So people are not Indian anymore, or they do not belong to the Indian subcontinent anymore. They are either Hindus, they're either Muslims.
Right.
And for either communities, they justified the violence. Because, the justification was, but the other party violated us, first, so we're just retaliating.
Right.
So I kind of find, that I kind of find, I really struggle with the voices that are presented to us in the mainstream historical narratives. It's almost out of, interest after reaching a certain age that, that I started engaging with partition literature, with the gendered aspect of partition literature, with the way I kind of saw that a nation was built on women's bodies. Nationality was marked on women's bodies.
Yeah.
Women were the markers of the ethnicity where they belonged. The question that I always ask myself, and I wish I could, ask the political leaders at that time, was, did the woman, did this individual woman sign up for this violence? Did she choose to be a part of this violence? Did you actually think about, all that is going to happen, that, for generations, people are going to live with this trauma and not necessarily acknowledge that trauma, but this intergenerational trauma of partition, of, I have heard my grandmother kind of say that when she was a little girl, how she had to cross the border with her family, and how her parents would often tell her that, they kind of found it hard to adjust to live in a land that was so distant from home. They had to start from scratch. They had to begin from the point where they left everything, and they kind of had to rebuild everything right from the beginning, right from the scratch. I mean, again, maybe this is the killjoy in me, but I always struggle with the question of, who made the choice and who paid the price?
Yeah.
So this is what I always struggle with.
Yeah, because there were no women making these decisions in politics, among the British that were, marking out these new borders. Yet they experienced a lot of the hardships. And additionally, people of lower classes, lower castes that experienced all the harms disproportionately, because it was a major kind of overturning of what everyone knew to be regular daily life. But on the one hand, it was a good move in that it gave some people a sense of identity, that they could associate, be it Muslim people or Hindu people, with a new territory they thought was theirs or understood to be theirs. But at what cost? How is these costs kind of played out, and against whom were they played out? And that's why you have the work of Manto really capturing that. And you said, that story of this woman who doesn't even
recognize
her
own mother,
because she lives in the borders between who she is now, who she was, choosing, or maybe she doesn't choose it, she might not even know. But I know nothing about this.
No, but it's just wonderful to kind of engage with a colleague on the issues, on the human cost of partition, on the gendered aspect of partition, because honestly, it doesn't get a lot talked about. Of course, there are scholars who are working on these issues, who are actively trying to engage with these issues, but for the common people, for the common masses, I really wonder if they at all engage with the questions of identity and of loss, of the loss of innocence, the loss of life, and here, when I say loss of life, I do not necessarily mean that, you die and you lose your life. But in Manto's short story that I mentioned briefly before, Coldo, I think it translates it as The Scream, Manto really depicts the impact of sexual violence, rape on women, where towards the end of the story, this is an estranged daughter, this woman goes by the name of Sakina. She was separated from her father while she was crossing the border, and then the father goes on looking for her, and he kind of asks a young group of men who were volunteering with the search party, and kind of helping these people who were crossing in numbers, who were crossing the borders in numbers to relocate. He kind of asks them if they know about Sakina. He describes Sakina to them, and it's interesting how Manto kind of brings the reader. Manto kind of takes the reader along with him in a journey. For me, when I was reading the story in 2019, I could visualize the events happening in front of my eyes. I could see, yes, those were, a series of words written on a piece of paper, printed on a piece of paper. But my imagination was actively, reproducing the imageries, and I could see a father, frantically looking for his daughter, and without even, without even telling myself, I kind of positioned myself in that place. Like, what would happen if I'm very close to my father. What would happen if I kind of, got separated from my father?
Yeah.
How would I navigate that? How would my father feel? And then, I think this is what they call vicariously living the trauma and, being a secondary witness to the partition. And when to the point where Manto kind of, like I said, that Manto takes his readers along with him on a journey. And when we reach to the point where we see that this young girl is found by this group of volunteers who first earn her trust, provide her with food, and then end up raping her a number of times. So, how does trust, morality, and ethics play out?
Right.
Manto is not only pointing out, to the crisis of humanity, but Manto is also pointing out that, there are circumstances, there are times when women's bodies become the carriers of their ethnicity.
Yeah.
Of where women's bodies are hypersexualized and objectified to a point that violating it, raping the body, is normalized. I kind of think, would the men think that, what they were doing was actually violating a woman? Because for them, probably the woman did not have the choice to resist them. The woman did. Probably, Manto does not tell us that, but I would like to think that she did. But what choice did she have? And then Manto kind of, takes us towards the climax, where the woman is found in a refugee camp, and her father kind of finds her there, and she's bruised. She's obviously, lying there because of lying there kind of unconscious, or maybe in a state of semi-consciousness because of the assault that she has endured. And the doctor walks in, and it's a dark room, and the doctor walks in, and the doctor asks one of his attendees to kind of open the window. And it acts as a trigger, it acts as a response, and immediately the trigger kind of demands a response. And almost immediately, the woman kind of tries, and she kind of unfastens the her trousers.
Right. It's
And
like
she,
open the window and she knew open meant.
yes, and she parts her legs.
Right.
So to be raped again, because she has, normalized the assault to a point where she equates it with her survival. Manto does not tell us how many times she was raped or sexually violated, or the way she was sexually violated, but the impact that it left on a woman who, whose immediate response to an otherwise innocent phrase is to unfasten her trousers and part open her legs to be raped again, tells you a lot about the crisis of trauma.
Yeah.
Like how trauma is kind of embedded, how the trauma is naturalized, how the trauma is normalized, and how trauma becomes a part of her identity. She's not able to distinguish, that's how I read it. She's not able to distinguish her identity as somebody who has been sexually assaulted and sexually violated from somebody who has been thrown into this mayhem, into this madness without her choice. She's not able to make that, kind of distinction. The knee-jerk response is to normalize it. That, this happened to me. So if I have to survive, I will have to repeat the cycle.
Right. Yeah.
And I do not have any other response to it but to lie there, but to kind of, to let these men assault me. At least they're not murdering me.
Yeah.
Sure, I'm being raped, I'm being sexually assaulted, but I'm alive. So I really struggle with that. Mm-hmm. And for this, in fact, is reflected in Sakina, the name of the woman, in her father's reaction. He is just happy to see his daughter alive.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing for him at that moment.
And that was kind of in this article, the author really highlighted that because, it was viewed that in many cases that if a woman was unpure, then she may as well be dead in some cases. But that was like, for Manto to depict the father being like, I don't care about that. I'm just happy that, I still have you in my life, was a significant thing.
Yeah.
And we could talk about this, in a little bit, but like a lot of the things that Manto depicted were not received well on the part of like the upper classes or castes, like by the politicians. They didn't want anything to do with what Manto was saying.
Yes.
Almost like they were trying to erase that past. Like they don't talk about that. Like that's not something worth mentioning.
Yeah.
But we don't have to go there yet, but that's...
Oh, well, yes, because, women's bodies are to be controlled by men. I mean, it's extremely distressing to see, a woman to be in control of her sexuality. Like, in Thanda Ghosh, that is why Manto was, charged for obscenity, because Manto's central character, Kalwant and Ishwar Singh, Kalwant Singh is the mistress, and she's sexually proactive, she is confident, she articulates, acknowledges, and acts on her desires.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is something that is not identified with, Indian women. Like, Indian women are supposed to be like, the culture, the way the culture, I think, constructs our bodies, where we are supposed to deliver pleasure to our male counterparts. There's absolutely no scope of acknowledging, identifying female pleasure,
Right.
or, women enjoying sexual activity as much as their male counterpart. If they do so, they are, I don't know, they're looked down upon. That's not normal on women.
Yeah.
But Manto explicitly talked about women's bodies and the things that women enjoy, and he described the nuances of the act, of the sexual, act between a man and a woman. And Manto did not see any wrong in that. I mean, there was consent, and there was mutual enthusiasm, between Ishwar Singh and Kulwant. So, for Manto to be writing at a time where there was so much censure around women's bodies, where women were not allowed to kind of exist beyond their caregiving responsibilities, or beyond their identities as the feminine presence in a man's life, it was distressing for men, because they just had no idea how to deal with women who, fictional women characters who were so well versed about their sexuality, were so much in control about their sexuality, and that is also reflected in Moselle.
Yeah.
So and I find it really interesting because Manto talks about women who would otherwise not be accepted in this society for their fierceness, for their unapologetic stance around their sexuality, around their femininity, or how they identify as women. I think that is what really stood out in Manto's writings. It's really interesting because Manto was playing with the characters. I mean, he was kind of depicting human trauma. He was depicting the trauma that was a product of the biggest mass migration in human history. But he was also kind of projecting characters, women who had a voice, who kind of were sure what they wanted. Manto gave that scope to their women protagonists. And I mean, I've been asked by some people, like, but Manto was a man, how can he be a feminist? My question is, I mean, I do not think that feminism is a brand that only women have access to. Manto is a feminist because he was far ahead of his time. Manto is a feminist because he was, academically, I won't say academically, but he was recording the trauma, the madness, the mayhem of partition through popular literature, through fictional narratives, but it was rooted in real people's lives. He was talking about women's, plight. Yes, there might be, some, I think some debate around, but, Manto, who is Manto to give voice to women? But I do not, I don't think I would want to contest that, because standing in 1947, where many women did not have a voice, Manto was getting charged with, obscenity, and was called to the court because his protagonist had a voice. Because Manto wanted women to have a voice. And I think a lot has to do with the context. I mean, sure, like today, many women speak about themselves, speak for themselves. They do not need anybody else to speak on their behalf. But in 1947, when women were being mass violated, when women were being brutally raped, when women were raped to the point that they normalized sexual violence, and they normalized that, getting raped is their chance to survival. Sure, Manto talking about those issues make him, an advocate for women. So,
my opinion would be that I agree, because I don't think you need to be a woman per se to be feminist, especially at the time, because how many writings are there from that time from actual women?
Well, there were, like Ismat Chugtai. I mean, at the top of my head, I can think about Ismat Chugtai, and there were, some authors in Bengal, like I think Ashapurna Devi and others who were writing. But yes, not a lot, definitely.
And for like a man at that time, like it seems to me like he used the privilege of being a man, considering the intersectionality of the, at that time, to bring these issues to light. And the fact that he was persecuted, like he wasn't ever convicted, or like he wasn't ever like found like guilty, I think, or sentenced to anything, but like he was brought to court numerous times. Is to me a sign that he was definitely disturbing the status quo. And the status quo was, as very much still is today in almost all parts of the world, very patriarchal and very classist. And to go against that meant to, in some sense, embody this progressive attitude. And while, like, yes, maybe not everything he said was or wrote was by today's standards feminist, writing 60, 70 years ago, like it's difficult to say, like, no, you can't be a feminist there because you were writing this at that time. Like, we have to acknowledge time. We have to acknowledge context in order to properly assess the validity of this, the person, the situation, their efforts. But again, I know nothing about this. I'm just an extremely privileged white dude in Canada.
No, but at least, you're willing to know about the history of the subcontinent and the partition and the bloodshed. And I kind of, we celebrated our 74th year of independence. And interestingly, again, like, in the popular narratives, like, of course, there were, many, many visionary men, women, who laid down their lives, who fought for the independence struggle. But I kind of feel that it is a disservice when, you're doing a disservice when you're not recognizing so many people who bore the price of the partition, the human price of the partition, because of their, because of their move, because of their migration. The independent states of India and Pakistan emerged. Their migration did contribute to the nation making, to the nation building. It was, they lived with the trauma. They did not seek for accountability. They kind of survived through PTSD. Women survived, women who survived sexual violence struggled to be accommodated within a society that values your worth on, that values your honor and your worth on your purity, on your sexual purity, on the way your body is touched only by your husband and not by any other man. And once any other man touches your body or violates your body, that becomes a completely different issue, that you are not a part of the society. You do not belong to the society. And I always find it very problematic the way ownership of the body revolves. I find it extremely problematic that how, through social constructions of identity, and of nationalism and honor, it's conveniently the honor of the nation, the honor of the community is conveniently put on the woman, who is then expected to uphold it, to protect it, without even, consenting to it, without even knowing that the honor has been put on her, that she has the responsibility. She did not sign up for it.
Yeah.
And the moment she is violated, the entire community is brought to shame. There's absolutely no discussion around, what this woman might need. What might be the immediate response to cater to her trauma, to both her physical injury, her emotional trauma. There's absolutely no discussion around this. It's always the community's honor.
Mm-hmm.
It's always how the community has been humiliated and how the ownership shifts. Now, when the community, when the woman is kind of violated sexually, the community conveniently takes back the honor and kind of gives the ownership of the body to the women. Now the body does not belong to the community. The body, which has been violated, now belongs to the woman.
Right.
It's now their responsibility what they want to do with their body. And there's absolutely no accountability within the community to see that the women are readjusted with dignity, with respect, because they did not sign up for the violence. They were a conduit of the violence. Their bodies were used as a weapon of violence. And a lot of discussions, and there's a lot of scholarly articles on how rape is used as a weapon of violence, but I strongly feel that women's bodies are used to violate not only the community but also the individual women themselves. I think, while rape is definitely one of the strategies that is used by violent communities to break the moral, to humiliate the other community, it's always women's bodies that are used against the individual woman itself. And essentially, the woman does not have any autonomy or ownership on her body. It either belongs to the community, it either belongs to her husband, and once the woman fails to uphold, to protect the honor that rests at the center of her being, the community or the society collectively decides that the ownership, that they have nothing to do with providing, justice to this woman, to providing, her with the space where she feels safe and welcome, where she feels that, she can seek for accountability or justice for the violence that she has endured.
Mm-hmm.
Violence is always, I feel violence is always imagined as a very singular concept. It's always about the community's violence, the community that has been violated. It's interesting how even when we are talking about rape as a weapon of war, we say that, a woman's body is used to humiliate another community. But, there's hardly any engagement with how the women are responding to their body memories, to the body trauma. Like how the woman's body is used against her will, against her consent, to violate her. She cannot come to terms with her own body because that is how the general perception goes around body, because a woman's purity is equated with, her virginity and how she should preserve her virginity for her husband and partner.
And in the case of India, and this might be a little bit of a strange question, but is the nation framed as a woman? Because like in United States, in Canada, like the nation is so often framed as like this woman, like this motherly figure, or we think of like Mother Russia, like the motherland. And I'm taking this from Sarah Ahmed and her book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, when she says that the nation is almost always framed like this fragile thing that is vulnerable to attack.
That needs to be protected.
It needs to be protected, yeah. But then it's ironic because people don't want to then protect the actual women. Like, they'd prefer the symbolic nation woman as opposed to the actual real day-to-day women that they see on the street. And they'd be like, oh, well, you know, in the case that I can speak to in like Canada or in the North American context, like, oh, she deserved it in the case of like a sexual assault because of what she was wearing. Like, she brought that upon herself. Whereas when it's like the nation, it's like, oh, well, we have to preserve the sanctity of the nation.
And you know, that's essentially what, when I said that, you know, it's, well, the idea of nation is equated with a woman, and the women of flesh and blood become the biological representation of that nation, of that community. So I think, you know, like you said, that you know, it's really ironic when you kind of have a feminine imagination of a landmass, essentially.
It's absurd.
Yeah, it's of a landmass, but when it comes to protecting the women and providing them with the space to address the emotional trauma, the physical trauma that they go through, because, you know, they are pushed at the front, because women are kind of identified as the biological replica of the nation, because it is associated with this feminine idea of the nation. Well, you know, nation is an abstract idea, like, you know, it is a piece of landmass. But the more concrete representation is the biological woman of flesh and blood who is pushed at the front. And so if you want to violate the nation, you violate the woman. That's the easiest way to break the will of the country.
Right.
So, yeah, that's why I said that, you know, I mean, if you ask me, hey, Deeplina, do you want to become the biological representation of India? Hell no.
Yeah.
I don't want to be, because, I mean, I am my own person.
Yeah.
And I don't want my body to be equated with anything else, with the idea of a nation, with the idea of a community. Well, you can ask, you know, can you really divorce your religious, your national identity? I can't. I mean, as in, back in India, as a Hindu woman, I'm more privileged. As a Hindu Brahmin woman, although I do not associate with my, with my Brahmin identity, I am actively trying to deconstruct it, because it's not only problematic but also inherently violent. But I also recognize that because of my surname, because of my position in the caste hierarchy, the kind of violence that I face or have faced is very different from the kind of violence that women have faced in the margins, that Dalit Bahujan women face. The kind of social mobility that I have due to my caste privilege, many women do not have that. And I've, you know, David, I've always struggled with the idea of disassociating with my caste privilege. I've always asked myself, how do I break away from the caste privilege? Do I drop, you know, my surname from my name? And I was like, well, if I'm doing that, how I mean that's definitely one way of kind of saying that I do not associate with my caste. But on the other hand, I kind of thought that if I keep my surname with my name, that will be a constant reminder that, you know, as a Brahmin woman, I have, in maybe in different circumstances, been associated with certain violent practices that have been inherently harmful for those at the margins, for women at the margins. And it's painful. It's absolutely distressing, disturbing, and painful to think that, I have contributed to that violence in some form. But I also feel that there needs to be a constant reminder to unlearn. That I have to, because unlearning is a lifelong process. I always, in my classes and also when I talk with colleagues, I kind of recognize, and I always tell them that I am a product of colonization. I cannot really say that, India is a post-colonial society. There are, we are entering into the 74th year of independence. There are, quote unquote, equality and, among people. But it took me a long time to identify, acknowledge, and consequently break away from the colonial biases that I grew up with. And nobody told me that, hey, those are wrong, those are harmful practices. You're actually reproducing, violent hierarchical practices. Nobody told me that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard work. But as Sarah Ahmed says, that feminism is homework.
Yeah.
You have to constantly engage and, ask yourself that how can I become a better ally? Mm-hmm. And to become a better ally, just symbolically, dropping my surname off my name is not enough. I'd rather, like you said, that I'd rather use my privilege and advance and amplify the causes of those who are at the margins.
I mean, that's a great... do you have anything else? That's a great point to conclude on, but if you have more you want to say...
Well, I think I'm really happy to be able to talk about the issues of gender-based violence and
because you said, it gets erased. It's ignored.
It's silenced.
Mm-hmm.
Some narratives, some responses are recorded through oral histories, like Urvashi Bhutalia's The Other Side of Silence. If anyone, if your listener wants to kind of, is interested and wants to read more about it, that's a very good resource. And I think there's a lot about, there's a lot to unpack, especially when we talk about post-coloniality. When we talk about post-colonial societies, because I do not suppose that you can talk about post-coloniality and post-colonial societies and, nation building without acknowledging the voices that are at the margins, that have been systematically silenced, and the bodies on which the nation is built.
Yeah.
That's all from me.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, great. So if anyone listened this far, thank you. I want to thank Deeplina for coming and, teaching me about this, because I knew very little about the partition and what it meant for people, women especially. And yeah, if you listen this far, thanks a lot. I'll leave some links in the description, some of Deeplina's writings and stuff that you can find there. Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. Take care. If you want to say bye, Deeplina says bye.
Bye.